Montana begins with space. More of it than most people are used to. A state big enough to swallow entire countries, yet so sparsely populated that long stretches of road may pass without a single house. This is the landscape that earned it the nickname Big Sky. Not because the sky is larger here, but because the land leaves so much room for it. The horizon feels wider, and the distances warp your sense of scale until miles start to feel like minutes. The name Montana comes from the Spanish montaña, meaning mountain. And indeed, sharp peaks define much of the landscape in the western half. The northern Rockies that rise in a tangle of ranges, each with its own character. Compared to the land around it, the built world feels small. Towns, most of them founded during the gold rush in the 19th century, cluster in valleys overwhelmed by the scale of nature. And in the far northwest, the wilderness doesn't just overshadow human presence, it erases it. Here lies Glacier National Park, perhaps the most recognizable and certainly the most popular place in Montana. A broad sweep of mountains carved by the slow retreat of ice. These ridgelines were formed long before any human name was attached to them. Layered sediment uplifted over millions of years, then sculpted into something recognizable by glaciers that advanced and withdrew like slow-moving tides. The protected area as we know it took shape relatively recently. In 1910, President Taft signed the act that established Glacier as the United States' 10th national park. A win for early conservationists who understood that the West's last great places were vanishing under logging and mining. But long before the borders were drawn, this region was the homeland of the indigenous peoples. The Blackfeet still refer to these mountains as the backbone of the world. Walking through Glacier, the geography does the talking. Valleys here are textbook examples of glacial carving, U-shaped and clean. The lakes are long, cold, and shockingly clear. Filled by snowmelt and glacial runoff that never quite warms. As the name suggests, the centerpiece of the national park are glaciers. And Grinnell Glacier is one of the most studied and most photographed remnants of the last ice age. People come here for the iconic turquoise water and the dramatic amphitheatre of rock. But the story starts with a man, George Bird Grinnell, who spent years exploring Montana long before conservation was a mainstream idea. He's the reason the glacier bears its name, and he was one of the loudest voices pushing for the creation of the national park. In 1850, during the end of the Little Ice Age, Grinnell stretched far down the Bison. By the time scientists began documenting it in the early 20th century, it was already shrinking. Today, Grinnell has lost the majority of its mass, more than half since 1966 alone. What remains is still impressive, but it's a fraction of the ice that once defined this place. Scientists project that many of the park's glaciers could disappear within the next few decades. A shift that will subtly rewrite the ecosystem. A winding ribbon of asphalt crosses the park, clinging to cliffs and threading its way between peaks. Going to the Sun Road. One long viewpoint unspooling over 50 miles, built during the early 20th century. Most of it between 1921 and 1932. The project demanded a level of persistence that bordered on stubbornness. Crews carved ledges into sheer rock faces by hand. Worked winters so harsh that even mules refused to continue. The goal wasn't simply to get across the mountains, it was to build something that blended into them without erasing their character. The road's name, taken from Going to the Sun Mountain, hints at the sense of wonder early park officials wanted visitors to feel. And while the phrasing might sound mythic, the geography here doesn't need embellishment. As the road climbs toward the Continental Divide, the valley opens in long sweeps, with waterfalls spilling down from hanging glaciers. The high point of the journey, literally and conceptually, is Logan Pass, sitting at 6,600 feet. The seasonal opening of the road, often delayed until late June by snowplows, is a small annual ritual that signals summer has officially arrived in Glacier. From Logan Pass, a narrow trail leads across open meadows, weaving through fields of wildflowers. This is the path to one of Glacier National Park's most recognisable but least complicated places. There's no grand geological riddle to solve here, no massive ice sheet or dramatic road carved into cliffs. At the overlook, Hidden Lake appears suddenly, sitting in a basin carved by a glacier that melted away thousands of years ago. It's long, deep and coloured with that same glacial clarity found throughout the park, though the water here is more subdued. Snowfields linger on the surrounding slopes, feeding small streams that trickle into the basin. Hidden Lake didn't play a major role in early park tourism, nor did it anchor railroad advertising campaigns. It became well known simply because of what it looks like. An archetypal alpine lake framed by sharp peaks. The park's unofficial ambassadors are mountain goats. Moving across impossible terrain as if gravity applies to everyone except them. Sturdy, quiet, and entirely unfazed by cold winds. Shaggy white coats, which look decorative at a distance, are engineering. 2 layers of insulation that can easily shrug off low temperatures. Their hooves have a split, concave design, giving them a combination of grip and balance that makes cliff bands look like gentle slopes. Glacier is one of the best places in North America to see them up close, as if they've leased the place out to visitors. Generations of goats learn that humans aren't predators. And so they pass by without hurry, pausing only to lick minerals from rocky outcrops. Predators hunt throughout the park, but cliffs give goats an exit strategy no other species matches. They can pivot up a sheer wall in seconds. Hooves finding purchase where most animals, and definitely most people, wouldn't dare look. Descending from the high country, the landscape loosens its grip. The sharp edges of the Alpine fade into something broader and more forgiving. Lake McDonald Valley, shaped by the slow, spacious work of a deep glacial trough filled with unbelievably clear water. It's the largest lake in Glacier National Park, about 10 miles long and more than 450 feet deep. Here the water is darker compared to the turquoise basins of the high country, shifting from blues to greens to mirror-like silver. What stands out instead are the stones. smooth, multicoloured pebbles that line the shore, shaped by centuries of tumbling under ice and water. Temperate forests of western red cedar and hemlock dominate the lower slopes. Species more at home in the Pacific Northwest than in the interior Rockies. This western side of the park sits squarely in a different climate corridor, collecting moisture thrown by weather systems that never make it to the plains. The result is a landscape that feels older and slightly wetter than the high ridges above. From Lake McDonald, cold glacial waters flow into the Flathead River. Which forms much of the park's western boundary. The steady rhythm section underneath the granite peaks, collecting snowmelt and carving pathways long after glaciers retreated. The river isn't a single thread, but a system. The North, Middle and South Forks, all of them cold, swift and startlingly clear. The portion most tied to Glacier National Park is the Middle Fork, which runs along the southern edge like a natural moat. This stretch of river is protected under the Federal Wild and Scenic Rivers Act that keeps it free-flowing and shields it from dams. The clarity of the Flathead is what stands out first. Look down from almost any bridge and you can see stones on the bottom as if they were under glass. The water gets its transparency from the high mountain sources feeding it. Meltwater, filtered through rock and forest. When the Great Northern Railway arrived in the late 19th century, it followed the Middle Fork closely, using the valley as a natural route through the mountains. At the point where the North Fork merges with the Middle Fork, the Flathead River slows. And for a moment seems almost deliberate in its direction. Spanning this confluence is a modest steel truss structure that carries both people and history across the junction. Blankenship Bridge, that stands today, is relatively modern. A replacement built after the catastrophic 1964 flood destroyed the original structure. The reconstruction used steel trusses placed on concrete abutments. And a careful alignment that balanced structural stability. Though practical in every sense, its utility does not diminish its place within the landscape. From the deck, the Flathead is a study in contrast. The North Fork brings milky glacial silt, The Middle Fork flows clear and cold. For anglers or kayakers, the bridge is a landmark, the place where journeys into the wilderness officially begin. West of Flathead, the Kootenay River begins far from Montana. Gathering itself in the Canadian Rockies before crossing the border. A few miles downstream from the town of Libby, the river gathers itself and drops over a broad shelf of rock, creating Kootenay Falls. One of the largest free-flowing waterfalls in the American West. It's not tall in the postcard sense. Instead, its power comes from width and volume. Dozens of channels spread across a massive bedrock terrace. During spring runoff, the flow becomes a kinetic wall of white, loud enough to feel in your chest. For the locals, Kootenay Falls is a sacred place, a centre of the world, a site of spiritual transition. Oral histories describe it as a gathering point for vision quests and moments of collective significance. Even today, this cultural weight is not downplayed. Signs at the trailhead acknowledge the importance of the site and ask visitors to treat it with respect. South of Kootenay, Lolo National Forest spreads across western Montana in a broad, uneven tapestry of mountains and rivers. Covering more than 2 million acres, it's one of those places where boundaries feel almost theoretical. As the region is less about human-drawn divisions and more about the natural systems that define it. Western red cedar grows in damp pockets. Higher up, subalpine fir dominates slopes shaped by centuries of wildfires. Fire is not a catastrophe here, it's a reset. Many of the lodgepole stands grew after massive fire events in the early 20th century. The name Lolo traces back to an early French fur trader whose exact identity has been lost to time. Possibly Lawrence, possibly Lulu. What remains clear is that this corridor was heavily used by Indigenous peoples long before any European trapping parties set foot here. Their trails threaded through the passes, connecting the plains to the Columbia Plateau. One of these became the now famous Lolo Trail. Later followed by Lewis and Clark in 1805 during their westward push. Known also as cougars, pumas, or simply cats, mountain lions historically roamed across nearly the entire American West. In Montana, their range contracts and expands depending on prey availability and forest conditions. The populations in and around Lolo form a continuation of one of the most enduring core habitats in North America. For Indigenous peoples of the region, lions were both respected and recognised as part of the natural hierarchy. They appeared in stories and teachings not as monsters, but as capable hunters that shared the landscape. In Lolo National Forest, the dense understory offers perfect cover. A hiker may walk within 20 yards of a lion and never know it. Biologists tracking them through radio collars and trail cameras confirm this. The cats are present, yet almost always undetected. Their hunting strategy relies on patience. Lions prefer ambush. Often watching a single game trail for hours before making a decisive leap. Leaving the dense forests of Lolo behind, the terrain opens into the broad expanse of the Flathead Reservation. Here sits the CSKT Bison Range, a nature reserve established in 1908. One of the earliest wildlife refuges in the United States. At the time, the American bison was on the brink of collapse. Reduced from tens of millions to a few hundred survivors. The irony, of course, is that many of those survivors existed thanks to tribal stewardship, who maintained private herds. When the federal government created the refuge, it did so on reservation land. Without tribal consent, and took control of the animals. That changed only in 2020, when the US Congress returned full management and ownership of the refuge to the tribes. It became one of the most significant examples of land restitution in modern US conservation. Today, the tribes manage the range with the same long-term perspective that guided their stewardship for generations. Missoula, the second largest city in Montana, is often described as the hub of 5 valleys because it sits at the convergence of 5 mountain ranges. It's not a frontier outpost anymore, and it's not trying to be. Part university town, part logging era legacy, and entirely defined by the landscapes that surround it. The city's name reflects history. Missoula comes from a Salish word meaning chilled water, referring to the icy runoff from the surrounding mountains. When European settlers arrived in the mid-1800s, first came a sawmill, and eventually the town grew around the wood products industry. The arrival of the Northern Pacific Railroad in the 1880s set Missoula firmly on the regional map. Timber, copper, and agricultural goods moved along the tracks, and the city became a hinge point for commerce in western Montana. The university came later, in 1893, and over the next century it shaped the town just as deeply, bringing students, writers, and a certain intellectual looseness that you don't often find in smaller Rocky Mountain cities. Meanwhile, Helena, the state's capital, was founded as a gold camp during the Montana Gold Rush. In 1864, a small group of prospectors stumbled onto a narrow gulch that would become one of the richest strikes in the Rocky Mountains. They named it Last Chance Gulch, and within months the hillside was transformed into a chaotic sprawl of hastily built storefronts. By the time Montana achieved statehood in 1889, Helena was wealthy enough to secure the title of capital. Even now, Last Chance Gulch still exists, though the pickaxes and sluice boxes are long gone. It's a pedestrian main street lined with brick buildings that carry the architectural afterglow of Helena's sudden prosperity. The early mining boom brought waves of entrepreneurs who invested in grand homes and even grander civic buildings. The result is a city whose historic core feels more ornate than you might expect for its size. One of Helena's most recognizable structures, the Montana State Capitol, reflects that era of confidence. Classical columns and a copper-clad dome. Montana sandstone and granite ground the building in its place, while the architecture follows the neoclassical style popular across the country at the time. The Cathedral of St. Helena tells a story rooted not in politics, but in the cultural ambitions of a mining boomtown. Its design draws directly from European Gothic Revival architecture, with pointed arches, flying buttresses, and twin spires that rise above the neighbourhoods. Inside, the cathedral houses more than 60 stained glass windows crafted in Munich. These windows, colourful and surprisingly elaborate for a town of Helena's size, depict biblical scenes alongside symbolic motifs. High in the Elkhorn Mountains south of Helena, Alta Mine is tucked among ridges of fir and lodgepole pine. The site was first developed in the late 1860s as prospectors fanned out from the booming gulches around Helena in search of new veins. Unlike the place of gold that made Last Chance Gulch famous, Alta's wealth was locked in the rock: silver, lead, and zinc. For a while, ore was hauled out steadily, processed and shipped east. But the mine's geology was rich in pockets, but inconsistent. By the 1890s, the richest ore above the main levels had been largely removed. The mine didn't collapse suddenly. It was fading slowly until the mid-20th century. Sporadic hope, modest returns, and eventual decline. Across southwestern Montana stretches Gallatin National Forest. Linking the northern edge of Yellowstone to the broad ranch lands near Bozeman. It's a landscape defined by the physics of mountains. Ridgelines stacked like overlapping waves. Created in 1899, the forest was part of the earliest attempts to manage and protect the West's rapidly exploited public lands. To the south and east, the Absaroka Range rises abruptly. A jagged wall shaped by ancient lava flows and erosion. Granite Peak, Montana's highest mountain at almost 13,000 feet, sits within the Beartooth Mountains. In 1959, a 7.3 magnitude earthquake struck near Hebgen Lake in the northwest corner of the forest. The event reshaped the landscape in an instant. Massive landslides dammed the Madison River, leaving 28 people dead. Out of the chaos formed a sudden, unnatural lake framed by jagged debris and stripped trees. Today, its calm waters belie the violence that created it. A destination for visitors drawn as much by history as by the view. From the forests and peaks of the Gallatin, our journey follows one of Montana's most iconic roadways, the Beartooth Highway. Officially US Route 212, it threads across some of the most extreme terrain in the northern Rockies. Beginning near Red Lodge, the road climbs steadily into the mountains that form part of the greater Absaroka-Beartooth complex. The ascent is immediate, pine forests give way to subalpine meadows, which eventually yield to granite ridges. At 11,000 feet, Beartooth Pass marks the highway's summit, one of the highest paved roads in the continental United States. Constructed in the 1930s, the highway was an engineering feat, carving its way across high alpine plateaus in sharp switchbacks. Surveyors and labourers worked with minimal mechanisation, blasting rock, laying the roadbed and stabilising slopes by hand. Winter snows limited the working season to a few months a year, and progress was measured in feet rather than miles. By 1936, the highway was open to vehicles, offering a link not only to Yellowstone, but to the growing tourist economy. Black bears are some of the most frequently encountered large mammals in Montana, and the forests of the Gallatin region are prime habitat. They're not the dramatic apex predators that headlines tend to focus on. That role usually goes to their larger cousins, the grizzlies. But black bears define much of the everyday rhythm of these mountains. They are adaptable, curious, and resilient. Adults typically weigh between 200 and 400 pounds, though individuals in lush areas can grow larger. Black bears are often portrayed as harmless compared to grizzlies, but that's an oversimplification. They are powerful, fast, and unpredictable in close encounters. Yet the vast majority of interactions end without incident. Bear-aware practices, securing food, carrying bear spray, giving bears space are standard lessons for anyone spending time in the forest. The goal is simple: keep bears wild and keep people safe. Long before the Bozeman streets appeared, the Gallatin Valley was part of the seasonal world of indigenous nations. They recognized the valley for what it still is today: fertile, sheltered, and strategically placed between mountain passes. When the Bozeman Trail was established in the 1860s, its route overlapped older pathways, connecting Wyoming to the mining camps of western Montana. The trail accelerated settlement but also intensified conflict. And by the late 1860s, it was closed under the Fort Laramie Treaty. The town that survived carried the founder's name but relied on something more durable than gold: agriculture. Then came the institution that would define the city's identity for the next century. Montana State University, founded in 1893. What started as an agricultural college grew into a research hub. The university also helped anchor Bozeman through economic swings that hit other towns. Over the last 2 decades, Bozeman has transformed from a college town into one of the fastest growing cities in the northern Rockies. The Madison Range rises west of Bozeman. A chain of peaks running north to south for nearly 100 miles. If the Gallatin Range is approachable and familiar, Madison feels more remote, shaped by old volcanic forces. The mountains anchor the western edge of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem in a patchwork of public lands. The crown of the range is Highlight Peak. But the interior holds wilder summits over 11,000 feet high. And long, folded ridges that rarely see crowds. The Lee Metcalf Wilderness protects over 250,000 acres of high country. Basins carved by ancient glaciers and forests dense with spruce and fir. The rivers tie it all together. With snowmelt from the mountains feeding surrounding water systems. Recreation has shaped the modern identity of the Madison Range just as ranching and trapping shaped its past. When Euro-American settlers arrived in the 19th century, the area remained mostly ranchland and timber country, but the ridges surrounding Lone Mountain were too rugged for grazing and too remote for large-scale logging. The concept of Big Sky as a resort town began in 1970. With Chet Huntley, the Montana-born news anchor. Huntley saw potential in the terrain itself. – 11,000 feet high Lone Mountain offered natural fall lines and enough vertical relief to rival ski areas farther west. Construction started almost immediately, and in December 1973, the first lifts opened to the public. Huntley died just months earlier, but his influence set the tone. A resort shaped by geography rather than gimmick. The ski area expanded gradually. Each decade pushing farther into the mountain's complex topography. As the mountains step back, the valley known as Paradise opens ahead. It stretches between two very different ranges, the volcanic Absarokas on the east and the older, more eroded Gallatins on the west. Their silhouettes create a corridor, a long geological trough formed by faulting that dropped the center of the valley while the mountains continued to rise on either side. That structural ball is what gives Paradise Valley its defining scale. Flat ground framed by dramatic elevation. Indigenous tribes used it as a route between the northern plains and the high plateaus near present-day Yellowstone. Later, homesteaders found the flatlands suitable for ranching, establishing some of the region's earliest cattle operations. By the early 20th century, Paradise Valley had become both an agricultural hub and a travel route. Today, the valley retains much of that character. Broad pasture land broken by historic ranches, surrounded by long views toward the mountains. Crossing Paradise Valley is the Yellowstone River that runs through this part of Montana with a steady confidence. It begins high in Wyoming's Absaroka Range. Fed by snowfields and small tributaries that gather speed as they descend. By the time it reaches the valley, the river has settled into a wide, sweeping pattern. Carving the broad corridor that people have used for thousands of years. Its claim to fame is simple, but significant. It's the longest free-flowing river in the continental United States. No major dams interrupt its course, which means the river behaves much as it always has. Shifting gravel bars, rewriting its channel with every generation. As Paradise Valley formed, when the central block of land dropped between two mountain ranges, the Yellowstone simply followed the lowest path. Over time, it carved the valley floor into the long, straight corridor visible today. Not dramatic, but unmistakably shaped by moving water. Further east, Bighorn Canyon feels like a shift in personality. Montana turning a corner from open valleys into something cut deep and unexpected. The land here doesn't rise, it drops. Sheer limestone walls fall toward the Bighorn River. The canyon began forming more than 300 million years ago. Back then, this part of North America sat beneath a tropical sea. The skeletal remains of marine organisms hardened into the grey limestone that now defines the canyon walls. When the region uplifted, around the time the Rockies were forming, the river held its course, cutting downward as the land rose around it. The resultant Bighorn Canyon stretches for more than 70 miles, crossing the Montana-Wyoming border. much of it filled by the waters behind Yellowtail Dam. The dam created Bighorn Lake, a winding reservoir that threads through the canyon like a narrow inland fjord. Motorboats, kayaks, and fishing skiffs now travel water that once ran wild. In Montana, marmots are part of the everyday soundtrack of the high country, living in places where survival depends on knowing when to disappear for months at a time. The most common species is the yellow-bellied marmot, found along rocky slopes from the Bitterroots to the Absarokas. They favour high alpine meadows and sun-warmed outcrops, anywhere with enough cover to dive into when danger shows up. Their burrows can run surprisingly deep, sometimes dozens of feet carved into soil beneath heaps of broken rock. These underground homes are designed with two purposes: escape routes from predators and a place to sleep through the long winter. Marmots are regular characters along hiking trails, sunning themselves on boulders, whistling warnings when a hiker steps too close. That sharp whistle is more than an alarm call. It's part of a complex social system. Marmots live in colonies, communicating constantly to manage sentry duties, warn young animals, and maintain territory. Set in a fold of the Montana hills, Virginia City was never meant to last as long as it has. Like most boomtowns of the American West, it sprang up fast when prospectors struck gold along Alder Gulch in 1863. Virginia City became the new heart of Montana Territory. A frontier capital built more on ambition than long-term planning. A few decades later, the boom had slowed. Many miners moved on to new strikes in Butte or further west. But the town didn't fully disappear. Enough people stayed, stubborn, practical residents who ran small businesses. And in the mid-20th century, preservationists recognised that it held something rare: a nearly intact slice of Montana's frontier past. Restoration efforts began in earnest in the 1940s and 1950s. Today, Virginia City remains one of the most authentic ghost towns in the country. A living museum where old wooden houses still creak in the wind and narrow streets look much as they did in the 1860s. Montana ends much the way it begins, with space, silence, and landscapes that feel larger than the stories laid across them. Towns leave their mark, but step beyond the last porch light and the wilderness takes over. Peaks rise, forests thicken, and the rivers run in the same cold patterns they have for centuries. For all the history written here, Indigenous cultures, mining booms, ranching, railroads, the land still carries the final word. The mountains, the prairies, the long, unbroken horizons. They remind you that human presence is only one layer on a much older surface.